I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s. And this week, we're going to be looking at a brand new genre, the comedy movies of the 2010s. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I talk about some of my favorite movies of the decade. Essentially, how the series works is every 3 weeks, we talk about my top 10 favorites of a certain genre. We've already done action, sci-fi, fantasy, romance. Now, we're into comedy. And this episode will be my picks of the top 10 best comedy movies of the decade, according to me, for 10 to 7. Next week is going to be my picks from 6 to 2. And then finally, I'll dedicate a sole video on my favorite comedy of the decade. And then, there's going to be horror upcoming and westerns. And we're going to be doing a lot of more fun stuff and maybe a little bit more abstract stuff down the road. But I hope you've been enjoying the series. And please comment below. Let me know some of your favorite comedy movies in the comments down below. I'd love to hear them. But we also talk about some honorable mentions. Every video in every genre will have 5 honorable mentions in no descript order before we actually get into my 10 to 7. Starting off with the first honorable mention, which is Deadpool. A super hilarious re-commentary on the superhero genre, the passion project of one Ryan Reynolds, a comedy that is in a lot of ways maybe defining of this decade. For a decade that was so dominant and the popularity was so dominant in terms of its consciousness with superhero movies. There have been so many movies, and if you've seen any movies in this decade, chances are there's a good chance that one of them may have been a superhero movie because of their increase and their dominance in the movie industry. So when we get a movie like Deadpool and a character like Deadpool that's been around in the comics, his role was just to always comment onto that, always be the overconfident, self-aware, kind of snarky, know-it-all kind of a guy who was able to sort of still work within the comic book genre and within the superhero movie genre, but is able to now sort of have this fourth wall breaking or this commentary of just sort of pointing out some of the elements of the actual film and some of the tropes and therefore making fun of it. And now this is a sort of type of filmmaking that I think dominated in the 2010s, particularly with the comedies, this idea of a meta commentary, of using the audience's predispositions and previous knowledge of film and film tropes and therefore commenting on it. The superhero genre, of course, being so popular so that when Deadpool comes out and makes fun of it, a lot of the reason why people enjoy it is because they sort of understand the joke and they're in on the joke because they're fans already of the superhero genre. And then, of course, it goes beyond the superhero genre and more into, I think, general action commentary. And this is not the first time that this sort of meta comedy has used before. We've seen in the late 80s to early 90s, was a common thing as well. Something like Spaceballs in 87, Naked Gun in 89, Hot Shots Part 1 and 2. During this time period was sort of making fun of those movies of the 80s and using that sort of meta element to make fun of it. So this type of comedy comes in waves. We didn't see this in the 2000s, which was more of a Judd Apatow, James Brooksian style heart, but sort of embracing the raunchiness of something like Animal House. Now we get sort of this type of comedy, and I think that for a decade that was so dominant and so consumed a lot of times by superhero movies, and for this type of comedy, there's a reason why I think this movie succeeded the way it did. It also succeeds because the character itself has become, larger into pop culture because of how sort of snarky he is and funny he is and sort of know-it-all, sort of that cleverness that I think a lot of people appreciate sometimes with filmmaking. Some people are really turned off by it, but some people definitely relate to it because they're in on the joke, they get it. I think it's also a testament to Ryan Reynolds as an actor. Of course, this is a passion project of his for a long time, and I thought he totally embodied the character based on my previous knowledge of Deadpool video games and comics I had read even before seeing the film. And his style of humor, that witty cleverness and one-liners really works well with the Deadpool character, and they're symbiotic in that sense. But also, I think he's a qualified enough actor and a good enough actor that he's not just a comedian, that he actually can sell some of the relationship. And that's some of the surprising elements of the film, is that, yes, you can have some of this meta commentary and jokes, of course, but then you can actually have sort of a real emotional connection to this character because of his relationship with Vanessa and their sort of back and forth that seems different than other superhero movies. That the twist is not only that he's sort of commenting and he's breaking that fourth wall and he's talking directly to the audience and making fun of maybe something that's going to happen, but also because there is still secretly an emotional connection throughout the film that you do care about. And I think the second Deadpool sort of succeeds to maybe a lesser extent, but to a different extent, I'd say, with the kid relationship. So That's, I think, maybe the secret sauce of this Deadpool series. But first and foremost, if you're a fan of the superhero genre, just seeing that sort of meta commentary, seeing that sort of self-awareness and just hilarious sort of crude teenage boy, I guess, type jokes, but definitely worked with me at the time. And Deadpool is one of the funniest superhero movies of the decade, so I had to get it in on an honorable mention. Then my next honorable mention is Four Lions, one of the most underrated comedies of the decade. A movie about a bunch of young Muslim kids from London who decide to become jihadists and suicide bombers. And that, on its statement, could be the most serious film in the world. What the film does, and the genius of the film, is actually making fun of them and not making them seem as these scary, terrible figures that they've maybe been portrayed in as the media, but as just morons and losers and people who can't get anything done the right way. They're just complete failures in every sense of the word, and how stupid they are. And a lot of the comedy comes from that, coming from that. These guys are just total buffoons, that they don't know what to do. They don't understand basic meaning and are constantly sort of influenced to the certain ideology, and that's where a lot of the humor comes from. It uses this dark humor to create an almost uncomfortable laugh within you because the subject is so dark, and the film doesn't sort of totally throw it away. It does have some of these slapstick kind of funnies and just showing how these guys are total buffoons and imbeciles, and just has some of that silly type of comedy that we've maybe seen in other American comedies. It also has sort of the smart wit that we've seen in British comedies, because I think it's also maybe one of the best satires of the decade. It's a movie that has those silly moments, but also has, it's really well written. It's not something that's totally reliant on improv. Of course, when you're tackling this topic, you almost have to include those political commentary elements, that sort of social commentary as well. And a lot of its lines are undercutting with its satire. Lines like, "You can't win an argument by being right," are cleverly written and sprinkled throughout the film. And on one hand, it's a really interesting satire, and it's also a slapstick comedy, and the comedy works really well here. But of course, with this subject matter, you have to sort of take it on its forefront, and it's very sort of biting in its satire, and it's making fun of these type of people who go on to commit terrible acts. But then also, you know, it does have this sort of underlying element of not maybe sympathizing with the characters or understanding where they're coming from, but an innate tragedy seeing these guys who are clearly lost, who are clearly don't have a purpose and don't understand things, are being sort of attracted to and gravitated towards this kind of ideology, which they're looking really for any answers possible, and it leads them down to this really terrible path, and there's a sort of a tragedy in that. So there is this sort of somber element, especially I think if you rewatch the film multiple times, but just from a jokes per minute standpoint, it's a movie that always had me laughing. It's a really hard task because you have this really hard subject matter, but the satire is biting, it's funny. The subject matter in itself is dark, yes, but they make light of it so much, and some of the small situational things that they're able to do really work well, just like buying the goods or practicing the suicide bombing. It can be very dark, but I think you couldn't help yourself a lot of times but laugh, and then also appreciate some of the tragic elements that are hidden within it, but also some of the very forefronted, biting and sharp and very smart and clever social satire that's going on here, and really making fun of these guys instead of sort of demonizing them that we've seen in other Hollywood movies and in the media. Then my next honorable mention is The Lobster, a movie that I was immediately drawn to the first time I saw it, and one of the strangest comedies of the decade, from director Yorgos Lanthimos, who has really spawned into having a great career this decade and becoming sort of a star director, starting off when I first saw him in 2016 with The Lobster, and then the next movie, The Killing of a Sacred Deer, and then The Favourite in 2018, which was of course a big Oscar movie. But the reason why I think he caught on, and the reason why he sort of connected to English audiences, was not only was he able to transition well, you know, a lot of foreign filmmakers aren't able to transition into English films. He was able to do so and still sort of keep his style and his sort of real awkwardness and sort of strangeness, but that is completely unique to himself, and actually makes his movies even funnier, but they're just very weird and strange and a different type and different brand of humor that maybe not would work for everyone, but actually is surprisingly more accessible than maybe initially thought. But if you don't know, The Lobster is about a dystopian society, or a futuristic kind of, or not futuristic, but an alternate kind of society where if you don't find a partner by a certain age, you have to go to this camp and you have, I think it's 45 days to find a partner, or else you're going to be turned into an animal. So this sort of strict sort of fascist, we'll call it, society where you must have a partner by a certain age, and if you don't have a partner there, then you're going to sort of be turned into an animal and thrown away by society. But that's the most absurdity you're going to get. That's the concept of the film in itself. But the way the lines are delivered aren't meant to be necessarily funny. They're played very monotone, very straight, and everyone speaks that way. It's a very sort of strange world, and the type of dialogue that is used maybe even be a funny line written on page, but the way it's delivered is very seriously and very straightforward and lacking any emotion. So there's often times where you feel uncomfortable and you're laughing, but you're not sure if you're supposed to be laughing because of how still the filmmaking is, of how sort of monotone the colors are. It's a very sort of gray film, and how straight-faced a lot of the actors are. There is a great absurdity with the film. There is a great awkwardness that occurs within the film. The filmmaking from itself, Yorgos Lanthimos, is able to construct this really well-made movie in terms of its visual style, in terms of its consistent sort of dialogue and feel, and how the story progresses. But there are some sort of really dark, hilarious, kind of absurd moments that you can't help but just burst out and laugh because of how how strict this world is, but even though the actions and the setup of trying to find a partner, or else you're going to be turned into, in Colin Farrell's character's case, a lobster. The absurdity of that, it propels the film enough, and the absurdity of the scenario propels it, even though the lines of dialogue and the way they're being said are not silly or goofy in that same sort of way, but it is still at least very situationally funny. My next honorable mention is What We Do in the Shadows, another pseudo-mockumentary like Four Lions, where we follow the lives of vampires if they existed in the real world, sort of like a reality show type of a situation and a documentary type situation. And the first introduction for me to another great talent similar to Yorgos Lanthimos, Taika Waititi, who co-wrote, co-starred, and co-directed this movie with Jermaine Clement. And I think this is a movie that is the perfect encapsulation of the style of comedy that Taika has able to sort of pursue. You know, Jermaine hasn't done so much of the directing, more so of the acting, and Taika has gone more of the directing style. But we see this in Thor Ragnarok, or we see this in Hunt for the Wilder People. This style of comedy, but I think is actually best represented in What We Do in the Shadows, and it's this New Zealand type of comedy. And that's something a little bit strange about comedies, is that each culture and each region and country has their own style of comedy. That there's American comedy, and then there's British comedy. And New Zealand comedy is something different in itself. It has some of the silliness and the goofiness of the physical gestures of something like American comedy, but still has that sort of dry wit and sarcasm of the British comedy. And the three guys in this movie are all unique and interesting characters, and they're all different, which what makes them funny. It also helps that the three performers are also very great and unique and different in their own ways, and sort of represent their own vampire trope. And it's interesting to see that, you know, these guys are very different, but of course they're all vampires, so they have to be roommates. So in one sense, it's sort of like this early 20s type roommate living your life in a city comedy, except the twist now is that they're vampires, and they milk every sort of last little bit of the vampire aspect of them living super old and being, you know, much older than some other people, and just trying to make normal human friends. But, you know, the problem is sometimes they die. You know, that happens often, and there often is sort of this sarcastic or dry wit to a lot of the lines, how they're delivered, and the complete seriousness to of course this absurd concept that vampires do exist. But then of course there is still some physical humor and of the physicality of someone like Jermaine Clement, or the lankiness of Taika, who is able to give you different perspectives of what it means to be a vampire in this world, and their different approaches. The concept enough is funny, but it succeeds because its ability to have many jokes per minute, its ability to have this really unique style. I mean, it's a mockumentary, and they stick to that. They're never sort of swaying from that. They're able to talk to the camera in that sense and give it a reality show feel, which of course other comedies that are not mockumentaries can't really do. And then the total commitment to the premise in terms of its dry wit, but also its physicality and some of the goofiness that occurs with that. A real sort of breakout for someone like Taika Waititi and his brand of humor. So if you like something like a Thor Ragnarok or a Jojo Rabbit, I highly recommend What We Do in the Shadows as a similar sort of comedy to some of his other movies, and succeeds in that way as well. Then my final honorable mention is The Wolf of Wall Street. This was a movie that I think really connected with people of this decade. Some people have it some of their best movies of the decade. Some people have it, especially my age, really connect with in terms of some of their favorite movies of all time. And while I really enjoyed the movie, I've actually only seen it through one time because it's 3 hours long, but I'm really a fan of certain scenes, but I still sort of struggle with the movie, which is why it's not on the list, which was why, even though it has some of the funniest scenes of the decade, in my opinion, that scenes that I always constantly go back to on YouTube, I'm not always drawn to the film as a whole, and I have problems with the film as a whole. Really starting off, with the 3 hours, for me, rewatchability is not a super important factor for everything. Some movies like Requiem for a Dream, I really appreciate. I've only seen it once, I'm never going to see it again, but it has such an impact for me. And I think that sometimes people place a little bit too much emphasis on rewatchability, but for comedies, I think rewatchability, being able to watch it over and over again and not get sick of it, is a real benefit to it. And I think that The Wolf of Wall Street being 3 hours makes me less likely to rewatch it than to rewatch just individual scenes on YouTube. I also have some ethical issues with regard to its ending and its overall tone of just almost too much of a celebration of this sort of lifestyle. I contrast it with something like a Martin Scorsese movie, Goodfellas, where it has that same sort of energy and rise, and man, I wish I was in the mafia. But then that second half, that last sort of third really, is the fall. You see the rise, but you see the fall. And the end of Goodfellas, you see Henry Hill saying, now I'm eating egg noodles and ketchup, and I'm a total schmuck. And that's the final shot of the film. It's a total degradation and total, he was the highest, and now he's just a normal schmuck. But then in Wolf of Wall Street, it's this great grand lifestyle, and he goes to jail, and he plays tennis, and then he gets out, and now he's a inspirational, motivational speaker. I don't think it has that sort of biting edge of this lifestyle or of the sort of characters that, and I think the effect of that was maybe negatively. You could talk about, in the public, and so that's some ethical issues I have with the film. Even though it's entertaining, even though I enjoy it, even though it's maybe one of Leonardo DiCaprio's best performances, the film as a whole I still really struggle with, and I don't go back and rewatch it, and the 3 hours hurts it. And so there's reasons why I just couldn't really put it on the list. But the scenes that I do like, the scenes with Matthew McConaughey, that initial lunch date, the stuff with Jonah Hill, who's just hilarious. Of course, the legendary DiCaprio getting paralyzed on Quaaludes and crawling to his car is just some of the funniest stuff of the decade. It is hilarious. It makes me laugh all the time. And I rewatch those scenes on YouTube constantly. But I think it's also important to mention that, that's the reason why I made an honorable mention, is because I like all these parts, but it didn't make the list because of some other issues I have with it. But without that, it's still very entertaining. It's still a movie that really connects with a lot of people. It has some great Scorsese filmmaking and needle drops. And DiCaprio, maybe his best performance, totally energetic, totally exciting and physical in many ways, and very comedic. This is a very funny movie. It has dramatic elements, but I think its core is really a comedy, and that's what I really liked about it. Okay, so now going into my list, my 10th pick is Bridesmaids.
You should come to Lillian's wedding with me.
No.
One of the most successful comedies of the decade, and a total powerhouse in terms of studio comedy and what studio comedy can achieve. It's got, for me, the total package of what I want from a comedy. It's got some of the best female comedians on the planet, just a total stacked cast of an ensemble characters and comedians. The star, of course, being Kristen Wiig, she's an actress that is maybe my favorite comedic actress. She shows up on this list multiple times and always makes me laugh. So her just being the star of this movie is even enough for me. You have Maya Rudolph as the sort of bride who has to control and try to keep all her friends together. Rose Byrne, who is super underrated and I feel kills it and does well in every role that she's in. You know, another funny movie that I liked is Get Him to the Greek, which was released this decade, and she has a small part in that, but is so great in that as well. Melissa McCarthy, this was her big introduction and has her own brand of humor and really is makes you laugh at every chance she gets. But also the movie succeeds because every one of these characters, and especially the main character of Kristen Wiig, actually has an emotional journey, an emotional arc. There is a real heart to the movie with Kristen Wiig's character in particular of just trying to get her life together. She's a mess, she's irresponsible, she's kind of lost in her life and is trying to find a relationship, but also trying to mend her own relationship and maybe feeling lost by her older friend in Maya Rudolph's character, the bride, and you know, her competing with her new friend in Rose Byrne. You know, another underrated movie which didn't make the list, but sort of is in the same sort of vein, is Bachelorette, which you know has its own sort of set of characters and is a different style of comedy. But if you like Bridesmaids, just a quick shout out to Bachelorette. But the ensemble is the strength of this movie, and the comedy, of course, is the strength of this movie because I think there's just an incredible cast, like a Caddyshack or something. Each character is so funny and has their own sort of style and brand of humor. And they're all out to shine. Kristen Wiig's character has her plane scene and her all that, you know, getting drunk on the plane and many more, of course. But like that sticks out for me. Or Maya Rudolph, you know, when she's in the middle of the street, you know, squatting with the wedding dress on, or Melissa McCarthy's character in the sink, and you know, it's just every character has their own little moment to shine. There's these great set pieces. There's an emotional sort of arc and throughout these characters. So you, especially with Kristen Wiig's character, understand her relationship and her losing relationship and her desire to still reconnect with Maya Rudolph's character, but still being kind of a mess up and a screw up and self-hating and self-loathing, and that sort of relatability that occurs with there. And I think there's different styles of comedy, which I mentioned. So if you don't like Ellie Kemper's kind of style, well, then maybe you're into Melissa McCarthy's style. And there's all these different types, and it always keeps you engaged. So I think it's a total package with just a great ensemble of amazing comedians that are able to just represent all different styles of comedy. So there's something in there for everyone, but also having a great emotional arc. And then a personal favorite for me being Kristen Wiig. I connected to her character, and it's great to see her being, you know, a lead. And of course, she wrote the film as well. So that's great to see as well. Then my ninth pick is Grand Budapest Hotel.
You can't arrest him simply because he's a bloody immigrant.
Take your hands off my lobby boy!
From legendary stylist Wes Anderson, Grand Budapest Hotel may be the most Wes Anderson movie to date. While he's been put mostly in the auteur prestige box of directors, he's one of the best comedy directors of all time, and especially of this decade. I could easily have put Moonrise Kingdom or Isle of Dogs on this slot, even though I went with Grand Budapest Hotel. You know, that's just a personal favorite, not of Wes Anderson's, but of the decade. And of course, the humor that he's been building and his style that he's been building, more in line with older screwball comedies with its rapid dialogue and its physical humor and physical gestures and even just the camera movements that are able to accentuate the humor. Of course, you have a brilliant performance of Ralph Fiennes as Monsieur Gustave, and his ability just trying to manage the hotel in this kind of alternate reality, which is this when they're under fascist regime, and the adventure that he goes on with Zero. And while the dialogue is peppy and has the screwball comedy elements and is very funny, and sometimes he'll go on great speeches and then, you know, just screw it and throw it at the end, and there is some of that great funny dialogue. It's less so about the actual jokes in terms of the dialogue, but there's actually a lot of physical humor. And Wes Anderson's style, the style that he's been building throughout the years, accentuates that humor. Wes Anderson is known for his symmetrical frames and his highly intelligent characters who are often maybe emotionally stilted or sort of sometimes can speak like robots or quirky and deliver their lines very straightly, but then will maybe sometimes have this primalistic, animalistic kind of tendency. And I think that's really best represented by Ralph Fiennes, who is sometimes incredibly poised and classy, and then other times he's trying to escape jail, and he's just, you know, telling him straight on and sort of getting rid of that facade that he's been put up. But that's Wes's ability to create interesting characters and his own style of comedy, his own style of characters with the dialogue and with some of the physical gestures and the great performances that he's able to get out of his actors. But also his camera movements and his visual style, which of course is so distinct, and you can recognize a Wes Anderson film from any frame. His distinct visual style actually accentuates on the humor and that physical element that I talked about. If you think of the guns fight scene in this movie, where he just pans back and forth and does these whip pans, or like these crash zooms, not maybe crash zooms, but very intense zooms. I guess they're sort of crash zooms. And then just even some of the decisions to hold and wide when they're sort of all together, and you can see, you know, a medium shot, and then we just see Monsieur Gustave start running, and we hold in the wide. It's not trying to make it seem immersive or chaotic or funny as we fall with him. It's just the sort of prim properness, and then immediately divulges into the primalistic sort of, you know, unexpected element. And I think that's what succeeds for comedy for a lot of people. And if you were to break down comedy, which some people like to do, especially with jokes, it's, you know, expecting one thing and then subverting the expectations. You think something's going to happen, and then actually it's not. And that's what makes it funny, because, oh, okay, right, that's how it sort of works. And oftentimes Grand Budapest Hotel works when it is this sort of prim, proper class world, and then it gets undercut by just random actions or odd actions, like just getting punched in the face or running frantically. It's some of these physical humor elements that no other movie really on the list embraces the physical humor like this. Of course, you have a great, just vibrant color palette and great visual style and interest when you watch this film. So that alone is enough to watch it. I also think it's very funny. I also think it has one of the best comedic performances in Ralph Fiennes, who just really carries this movie, in my opinion. And having this storybook kind of Wes Anderson style aspect is comforting and is always great for rewatches. Then my 8th pick is Spy.
You really think you're ready for the field?
Damn it! Who puts a roof on a scooter? What are you, the Pope?
Another kind of underrated comedy, and one of the underrated comedies I think on my list, even though it was successful. It's a movie that I think was released at a time where there was a lot of fatigue from Melissa McCarthy, because she broke out in Bridesmaids in 2011, but then had a lot of stuff with The Heat and Tammy and Identity Thief. And there was maybe a little bit too much Melissa McCarthy and too much of, oh, Melissa McCarthy does this one thing, and if you don't like this one thing, well, maybe you don't like her. But then when Spy comes out, she actually shows that she's a really multifaceted actor, and we see once again with Can You Ever Forgive Me that she can do another type of element, or another sort of maybe more serious version actually of this character. But Spy was the first introduction, at least for me, of showing Melissa McCarthy is still a really strong comedic talent, but can do something else as well, which makes her a real comedic powerhouse. Instead of being the obnoxious, tough, sloppy girl, she plays a CIA pencil pusher named Susan, who just falls into being a spy. And the movie has this sort of dueling personalities and tones of humor. I think Melissa McCarthy's character of Susan is really sweet and kind and gentle, and you really care for her, and Melissa is able to bring that empathy to his character, who is really passionate, but maybe doesn't like to take risks and wants to do something, but has sort of been put into this part and still wants to sort of do something with her life, even though she's a little bit older now. And then there's also the sort of cutting ensemble of spies, and who often roast Melissa McCarthy and make fun of her directly to her face, which is, you know, funny in that sense, just the crazy kind of combinations that they can come up with. And, you know, even though this is Melissa McCarthy's movie, she doesn't actually maybe have a lot of the funny elements. I look at a guy like Jason Statham, who's playing things very straight and is going for it, but is still the embodiment of this total action hero. And he has these speeches that he goes on, or these small lines of dialogue that are just really funny and fun to watch, and are, once again, for comedies, clips and stuff that I can rewatch are always fun for me. And that's, you know, his speech, some of his speeches are clips that I come back to, and him just really just going really hard and roasting Melissa and Susan Melissa's character Susan, right to her face, is funny as a sort of super macho, total badass spy. But yet still, Susan is one that is able to actually, have the fight scenes and does her job, and she's not just a complete bumbling spy or whatever that you think it was. She has some ability and has some smarts and wits to her, so it's not just like, oh, here we go, she just sort of lucked into this. That you definitely empathize with her and feel bad for her, and people are constantly underestimating her, and of course there's some funny moments with that, and there's still the villains of some like a Rose Byrne who once again kills it here, or Jude Law, and so the great spy work there, but then Melissa's character coming in and upending that. It's a sort of a great fish out of water story, but different than what you think it was. You think it'd be like, oh, this overweight spy comes in and messes things up and stumbles her way, and oh, she's a genius. It's like, no, it's actually a really empathetic character you really care with, who actually has skill and ability, but she doesn't maybe look like the traditional spy. That doesn't mean she's not a good spy. And then some of the hard-hitting kind of jokes are also funny, so it works on this dual action comedy kind of element. And it's a movie that I constantly rewatch and constantly go back to. It's a personal favorite of mine, and I think it's one that is maybe not talked about as much and is, in my opinion, better than Bridesmaids. So if you like Paul Feig, his style of movies, I think you definitely should check out Spy. Then my 7th pick and the final movie we're going to be talking about in this video is Anchorman 2.
I don't read Jet Magazine or Jerry Curl Daily.
What are you doing?
I'm breaking down the barriers of race by assimilation. And on that note, which one of you convicts with the longest record can pass me the mashed potatoes?
Like Spy, it's another movie that was shadowed by its predecessor in another movie. Anchorman 2 is, in my opinion, just as, if not better, than the first Anchorman, even though at the time it was criticized because you're making a sequel to one of the best comedies of the 21st century. Now, all this time later, and in my opinion, they're on equal footing. Now, I have a unique relationship to Anchorman 2 because the first Anchorman movie I saw was Anchorman 2. So this was my introduction to these characters, and maybe that's the reason why it's so high on my list and why it's on my list in the first place. But I'm a big fan of Adam McKay, and I really like all of his comedies. The other guys definitely could have made the list. Talladega Nights, Step Brothers, and then his sort of more recent political leanings are also very funny in The Big Short, and especially Vice. But Anchorman 2 is just as funny as the first Anchorman, and has as many jokes per minute, which few comedies rarely have. In my opinion, I love these characters so much, of Brian Frantana, of Brick Tamland, of Ron Burgundy, of Champ. The team together as themselves have such great chemistry, and these actors, David Koechner, Paul Rudd, Steve Carell, Will Ferrell, they're all comedic legends in my mind, and are able to really work off and bounce off each other and make you laugh at every instant, every second. It's always going on, and they never really give you a second to breathe. And there's also not a lot of maybe character development that something like Spy has, but I don't necessarily care because I'm looking for the jokes here, and this movie has one of the highest jokes per minute of the decade. I remember seeing it in the theater for the first time. I had a great movie theater experience. I think it's maybe the hardest I've ever laughed in a theater. I know exactly where I was, just because of the absurd silliness and the complete commitment to the bit. I like, once again, Kristen Wiig, who shows up here, and her stuff with Brick and that sort of relationship. The characters in themselves, I mean, I personally could see 10 Anchorman movies. For me, the characters are just so funny. I just want to see these guys riff and go back and forth with each other. But I also think the movie is tighter than maybe a lot of people will give it credit for. The sort of re-teaming together and finding where they are and where they've been in these past couple of years, getting the team back together. And then Brick, and then going to the 24-hour news cycle, and we get some of Adam McKay's political elements. We saw, actually, if you watch the end credit scene of the other guys, it shows you that, like, wow, McKay's really interested in the sort of 2008 scandal and what happened there. It's a whole thing. Like, I can't believe I didn't see it when I saw the other guys. Of course, he would go into politics, and even Anchorman 2. It's a real satire of this 24 news and the degradation of journalism that we've seen in something like Network, where it's just all about ratings and getting whatever makes the most clicks. Would be the nowadays example. And of course, now the funniness is now these sort of buffoons that are the ones that stumble onto this, and the ones that have no journalistic integrity are kind of the ones that are able to succeed here. So then we see their sort of rise there, but then also the fall, and the sequence with Ron Burgundy when he's blind, I think was just completely hilarious and maybe my favorite part of the movie. And then that sort of third act, which is the final fight scene, which in my opinion is the really only derivative thing. I think comedy sequels are very hard to do, and I think we should give a lot of credit to something like Anchorman 2, because in my opinion there's really, like, Anchorman 2 I'm thinking of, and like 22 Jump Street, but not a lot of comedy sequels from this decade, and not a lot of comedy sequels in general do well. And for me to have this many jokes per minute and to really like these characters still and get funny moments from it and quotable lines, in my opinion, Anchorman and Anchorman 2 are just on that same sort of playing field that I'll do an Anchorman marathon one day and I'll watch back to back. That's where it sort of stands in my mind. And yeah, the only thing that repeats is the final fight, but then we get Kanye West appearance, so that's good in my books. And for me, it's just a total constant, energetic, always laughing, non-stop movie. You could argue that maybe the end sort of lags a bit, which I kind of agree with, but the jokes are still there throughout the film, in my opinion, and I love these characters. I just want to see them do funny stuff. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Comment below, let me know some of your thoughts on my picks, on some of your favorite comedies of the decade. Give some predictions maybe of what's my number one, or of what's my 6 to 2 picks. That's about it, guys. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. And until next time, stay tuned.